All right, hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're talking about the party system and specifically about this tripartite model of political parties that I referenced in the previous video. Again, we want to think about political parties from three distinct perspectives in our theories, and that is to break down a single political party or a single party institution into three specific parts. First, of course, as I've mentioned, the party in government, that is the individuals who actually hold office, the people with R's and D's next to their name in Congress and other legislative bodies across the country. Second is the party as institution, of course. That is people who are not elected office holders, but who work either in a pro bono, a volunteer perspective, or in a paid capacity for political parties to help elect their candidates. And then finally, the party and electorate, which is essentially just ordinary people who have attachments to the political parties. That is, these identifiers who believe themselves to be closer to one party than the other. So individually and together, these three components of the political party system, I think, is going to help us, or they are going to help us understand what it is that political parties are, and critically to answer that question we posed in the last video, which is to say, why is it that partisanship tends to move, even though at the individual level we can think about being a fan of one party over the other means that is essentially a very stable kind of attitude. So I think to answer this question, we need to go back to an even more fundamental question, which is why do we have parties in the first place? And if you think about it, beyond the framers of the Constitution bemoaning the sort of origins of the party system and the feud between Jefferson and Hamilton and all the Virginians getting mad at the Federalists and stuff in the early days of the Republic, we know that political parties form theoretically for a variety of reasons. Really, if we think about the definition of what a political party is, it's an organized group that attempts to influence government by electing members to political office. I think we get a good sense of what that's about, right? Political parties are essentially vehicles for trying to elect candidates to office that are going to do stuff that political party wants. Of course, it goes without saying, as I've mentioned, that many Americans, including George Washington, viewed parties, or in many of these letters and other communications, factions. These were viewed as being incredibly dangerous, and specifically because they were worried that factions would break down some of the delicate checks and balances that the system had designed. But there's actually, I think, some scholarship out there that really makes a persuasive case to argue that parties are relatively inevitable when we have a system like this. And that is because they are what we might call endogenous institutions. They're institutions that are created to perpetuate the power of specific individuals that then go on to strengthen as they perpetuate power for those individuals. So it's this kind of reciprocal relationship, a feedback loop, per se, where parties benefit individuals in government, and that leads them to continue to strengthen the party in order to derive more and more benefits. And specifically, these specific institutions are designed to solve certain collective action problems that you might think about. And so if we think about the elite level, these office seekers and these office holders, there are certain collective action problems that parties really help to accomplish. And so for one, we might think about the office holders. Right? Office holders are, of course, constantly trying to win office and, of course, to have re-election. And so if you're in Congress, it makes a lot of sense to be able to solve a collective action problem by getting together with some like-minded people to be able to share the benefits and resources that are required to help you win re-election against potential challengers. And so it's essentially a defense mechanism where you say, well, why don't we pool our resources? Those of us who are in Congress will be able to get together, and then we'll be able to be more effective at defeating challengers, and we'll be able to stay in office, which is, of course, our number one goal. And so office holders and office seekers are very much motivated to join and form political parties simply because it helps it become much easier for them to stay in office. And of course, if we think about that, there's a certain cynicism baked into that, which is to say, this almost seems unfair. The idea that these people are able to communicate at the elite level, get together, and then defeat challengers. This results, I think, in a very negative view of party organizations. And it's actually quite interesting to think about this because, in fact, if we look at the history of the American Political Science Association, or actually political scientists, there was a point in time in American history when American political scientists argued that Americans essentially needed stronger parties. That the party system that we had in the 1950s, for example, wasn't strong enough. There wasn't enough differentiation between the two parties. We actually needed more parties, not a larger number of parties to say, but we need stronger. The two parties need to become stronger and need to be better at expressing themselves and differentiating between themselves. Of course, today I think Americans would say that's crazy, right? American political parties are highly polarized, are highly powerful, and essentially the whole story in Congress is about the two parties fighting each other. And so parties maintain control over a lot of different things in our modern political context. For example, the primary system, which helps to select candidates for the main general elections that we have. So, for example, Trump and Biden are selected by their respective parties to serve as the role of the candidates for the Republican and Democratic parties. And these parties control all kinds of access to things beyond just primaries and nominations, such as funding, right, fundraising. And if you're running in the House of Representatives, you want very much to align yourself with your political party to be able to attract resources. And critically in today's period, voter data. But again, I think one of the reasons why these party systems and these party institutions are viewed so negatively by the American public is partially going back to another era in American history when parties were really sort of very, very, very bad actors, especially when it came to this process of trying to nominate and select candidates for office. And so we can think about a little story here about a young man named Harry S. Truman. In fact, this is not a typo. The dot here after his middle name is omitted on purpose because his middle name actually was S. His parents couldn't decide on what to call him. They had two different family names that started with S. So they said, we're just going to name him Harry S. Truman. That was his entire middle name. So this is not an abbreviation. Fun fact. Let's imagine that you're this young man with one letter for a middle name. You might live here in Missouri, near Kansas City. And of course, those of you who know something about Harry Truman know that he was actually somebody who served as an artilleryman in World War I. Very dangerous sort of job, and managed to survive and come back. And he gained prominence as a haberdasher, which means he sold like fancy clothes, fancy hats and belts and other sort of accessories for fashionable young men who wanted to go party in Kansas City. But of course, this thing called the Great Depression comes along, and you might imagine that very few people have much of a budget for bow ties and hats at that time. And so, because of the fact that the Great Depression ruined his business, Harry Truman felt that maybe now is the time to get into the world of politics. So this young veteran, small business owner, decides that he's going to try to get into politics. And so there he is. It's probably an image of Harry Truman that you may not have seen before, given that most of the time we see him while he was the president. Good-looking young guy, right? Of course, he's got his hat and his bow tie. Any good haberdasher would have one. And so let's imagine that you, as this Harry Truman character, try to get your name on the ballot for just a very minor political office. You're going to say, I'm going to weather the Great Depression by getting an office here in Jackson, Missouri. I'll try to become the county court judge. And so you might be surprised to realize that every time you mention that you're thinking of running for office, everybody takes you under their wing and says, you got to talk to Tom Pendergast if you want to do that. And you can imagine being really confused by this, right? Who's this Tom Pendergast? This Tom Pendergast is not the county election board official or anything. This is just a random private citizen. And why is it that I have to talk to Tom Pendergast if I want to win an election? This seems very confusing. Isn't the election open for anyone? Well, sure, they might tell you in Missouri, but you can't expect to win unless you've got the support of the Pendergasts. So this, of course, is a story that might be reminiscent to those of you who have any knowledge of the historical period in American parties called the Machine Era. And so here's Tom Pendergast, who looks very much like a movie typecast sort of mob villain kind of guy, right? He really looks like he'd break your kneecaps for almost any reason. This is Tom Pendergast, and of course, this party boss who lived in Missouri at the time was very much akin to some of the other major party bosses of the era. For example, William M. Boss Tweed. So you can see that this political cartoon from that time. You can see this this ad or this cartoon is called "Under the Thumb." Here, this is the caption, indicating that the view from New Jersey shows that Boss Tweed is crushing New York under the thumb of his sort of undue influence on the world of politics. So these were the party bosses: Boss Tweed, Tom Pendergast, and others. Essentially, a party machine was a party organization, a party as institution that was controlled by specific private citizens who had access to a lot of money and a lot of social influence. And more specifically, more problematically, these machine-era bosses were able to influence elections because they had access to control over the ballot boxes. And so they were able to essentially engage in all kinds of very shady practices, like voter intimidation, and other kinds of things. They would bribe people for votes. In fact, to this day in Louisville, Kentucky, liquor sales are outlawed on election day because of the degree to which liquor was handed out at the polling places to persuade people to vote for one candidate over the other. So you get a shot of bourbon whiskey if you voted for the machine party's candidate, and you wouldn't get any if you were to vote against that individual. Keep in mind also that many of these elections were not as secret in the 19th century as they are today. You'd be able to tell pretty instantaneously who everybody was voting for at the polling place. Even in some of the earliest elections, these kinds of things were actually done by casting, very visibly casting like pieces of dry corn in a bucket and stuff. So you'd be able to know who you voted for. And so really the national elections at the time were these very corrupt party machines who were swaying people's votes with bribes and intimidating voters. They clashed at the national level, and that's where you would see the famous sort of smoke-filled rooms where the Chicago machine and the New York machine and other machines would get together and determine who would be the nominee for the presidential election after closed-door kind of meetings. And so that was the idea. It was that Boss Tweed and Pendergast and all these other people would be essentially the people with all of the control over the nomination process at the federal level. And so it wouldn't be until the late 19th century, the 1890s through the 1930s, that a progressive movement sought to respond to this concern. And so if you remember, we were talking a little bit about the sort of populist sentiment undergirding public opinion polling and John Gallup at the time. This is kind of the same spirit, where people were saying, look, we need more democracy in our politics, and we need more oversight over things like elections. And not only that, but all kinds of other institutions like education. The women's suffrage movement comes out of this. A number of different sort of big public movements towards better accountability in government come out of this period, especially in response to kind of the unhinged period of the Roaring '20s. And so they really pushed for all kinds of different reforms. And this is one of the reasons why today we don't have strong party machines like we did at that time. And that's because essentially grassroots lobbying, these rank and file citizens got together and tried to pass changes essentially to laws that would protect and increase the privacy and the quality of our elections. And so here's John Dewey. You might know him from sort of studies of education, very important in reforming America's public education system at the time, and also sort of a staunch advocate for these ideas. So one development that the progressive era sort of grassroots lobbyists tried to push for was a primary election. This is something that very few people anywhere in America had at the time of these progressive era inventions. Essentially, the primary election, again, is a chance for voters to cast ballots to choose the candidates that are going to be eventually on the ballot in the general election. So again, instead of a smoke-filled room in a convention where a bunch of rich party bosses would basically pick a candidate and then voters all across America would have no choice but to vote for the two candidates essentially on offer. In this case, voters actually got to determine who was going to be on that general election ballot. And so as we go state by state through this progressive era, we saw that primaries started to become the dominant form, essentially, of choosing candidates. And so there was massive reform to the parties themselves. And so that's the thing to remember, is that these processes by which we select the candidates that are going to eventually run in the general election, those are determined by the parties themselves. There's not very much sort of state control over this process. It's really about the parties themselves. And so parties, for example, even today get to choose whether you're in an open or a closed primary system. And so, closed primary means that you have to be a registered member of that political party. You need to put on your voter registration that you are registering as a Democrat or Republican to vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, respectively. Whereas open primaries, you can vote in one primary, but you can vote in any of the primaries. So if you're a Republican, you could choose to vote in a Democratic primary if that was, the one that was relevant to you that year, or if you're a Republican, you could vote in the Democratic primary under open primary rules. Regardless of how these things are conducted, the primaries essentially crushed the power of machines because the machines were no longer able to engage in this quid pro quo, which is essentially to say that, hey, if you're a young Harry Truman, you've got to get elected, or you've got to go to Tom Pendergast, get his nod of approval. Tom Pendergast will do the corrupt stuff to make sure that you get elected. And that he'll only do that with the handshake agreement that then you will give him all the kickbacks in government. You'll give him essentially no bid contracts. You'll do all the stuff that he wants, essentially. You'll be a politician that works ultimately for Tom Pendergast and not for the public. And that perpetuates and supports the power of the bosses. It's just essentially a closed circuit. This breaks that power because the voters can choose and they can say, we don't really want Harry Truman. We want somebody else to run, as a Democrat in, whatever county, Missouri. And so Tom Pendergast, they might say, oh, that's Tom Pendergast's candidate. We actually don't like him. We don't want him to have control over our politics. We're going to explicitly vote against candidates that we know are being influenced by Tom Pendergast. And so essentially, again, these primary systems helped to break down the ability of party machines to have massive influence over the political process and really, really sought to reduce the corruption inherent in a system like that. So we had a much less corrupt politics going into the 20th century, which is a really positive thing for voters and a positive thing for democracy. And so today we have a far different system indeed. And that really is the idea that our party organizations are these vehicles that exist to help elect candidates to office. They're loosely organized around political candidates. And so that's what we might call a candidate-centered party organization. So if you think about, the most recent primaries, for example, the Democratic primary for the presidency, which would eventually select Joe Biden to be the 2020 candidate, out of a huge array of different candidates. We've got Bernie Sanders, we actually have Kamala Harris, who ended up being the vice presidential pick. We've got Pete Buttigieg, we've got all kinds of other people who were running there. Right? The party essentially is waiting in the wings during these procedures and waiting to support and undergird whichever candidate emerges victorious in that primary process. And so essentially, the party rallies around candidates who are able to signal their competency and their popularity, largely through the primary process in the various states. And then they come in with the sort of big guns, right? The support, the data, the funding, all the stuff. But even at the state and local levels, this is also true, where the party is waiting in the wings and waiting to essentially serve as this kind of rocket ship to success for the variety of candidates that are going to signal their competency. And so two of the major institutions that do this are the DCCC, or the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So they're the individuals who work in the Democratic Party to try to support and sort of target individual House races for funding and for additional attention. The same thing happens on the other side with the Republicans. They also have a congressional committee that works to try to support House candidates all across the country. And of course, there's similarly institutions in both parties for the Senate as well. And so, again, these party organizations now are laser focused on candidates and are trying as much as possible to support candidates that are able to win primaries and are able to signal their competency to voters. So it's really the candidate now that's at the middle of this story, not a party boss, not somebody else. Right? It's the candidate that is essentially the focus. Now, when we think about parties, right, we also have to remember that these parties are, of course, extraordinarily broad-based. They're what we call big tent parties. And so the party organizations are certainly thinking very much about this third piece of the tripartite or three-part model of parties, that is, the party's an electorate. And so the two parties are ultimately competing across time and across space for voters, for potentially these voters in the middle of the distribution, the voters that are trying as much as possible to make up their minds about who to vote for. And so these contests are really all about the party institutions coming around specific candidates with money, with data, with volunteers, with all of the resources at the disposal of the parties to be able to compete for these specific demographics. And parties often are very instrumental in helping candidates essentially create their platforms of the specific issue positions that they say are important. And those issue positions are, of course, targeted towards winning over specific demographics and tilting the election in the favor of the preferred candidate. So in the 1800s, though, we didn't have a situation like that where there were essentially two parties and we had this, this sort of very close balance and campaigns that were trying to inject resources into specific races. Instead, we had what we might call party fragmentation, where we had all kinds of different parties that would sort of come into conflict with each other. They would come to loggerheads. They would split. They would reform. We had all kinds of new parties that were constantly reformulating. And we can go, for example, to the election of 1860, the sort of famous election in which Abraham Lincoln wins the Electoral College without the majority of electoral votes. Essentially, these parties were constantly splitting and reforming. But really, in the present period, the reason why we've got this very, very durable kind of two-party system that is very competitive goes back to the New Deal period, as we've talked about. And so the New Deal coalition, this is Roosevelt's New Deal coalition, ultimately consists of a variety of individuals who were especially galvanized to support this legislation on the basis of their essentially their exposure to the Great Recession. So unionized workers, intellectuals, professionals, Southern farmers, Catholics, Black and African Americans, immigrants from Southern, Eastern, and Northern Europe. Essentially, a lot of different people fell into this New Deal coalition. Again, it's a diverse coalition of a variety of different industrial classifications, a variety of different racial and ethnic groups, a variety of different sort of lived experiences in American politics. But this has ultimately come to form the backbone of the Democratic Party's coalition up to today, essentially. And part of party contestation in the present moment has been about the sort of conflict between these different groups as they seek to influence essentially what the party platform will be at the national level. And so if you think about this coalition, right, this New Deal coalition, you can ask yourself an important question, which is to say, if you're a candidate, what percentage of the vote are you trying to win? If you're a party, what percentage of the vote are you trying to win? If you think about this, right, if you're a candidate, I'm sure that you would be very comfortable winning with 100% of the vote. You would love it if every single person in your district would want to have you as their representative. If I were a candidate and I got 99% of the vote, I would feel great. It would mean that I would feel like I could do whatever I wanted in office. I would feel very supported, and I would feel like there's a good match between my stated party platform and the wishes of the voters in my district. But if you're a party, it turns out that the percentage of the vote that you're trying to win is actually not 60%, 70%, 80%. You want to win a slim majority. And that is because there's sort of a classic maxim in this party discussion, which is that if you get a party that grows too large, as we saw in the 1800s, essentially many times, large majorities end up eventually sowing the seeds of their own destruction. Because large majorities will eventually what's called a wedge issue will develop that will seek to fracture that majority as some voters start to realize that they are not well represented by that large party. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, right? You may be confused by this as you're thinking about it. You don't want too large of a majority because those majorities contain the seeds of their own destruction. And this is what we might call the theory of minimum winning coalitions. You always want to win just enough people so that your message essentially doesn't get distorted because the tent gets too big and you're having to serve sort of two sides of an opposed coin. So the biggest example of this that we could think about is in the 1960s. And certainly you can read more about some of this stuff in your textbook. In the 1960s, that New Deal coalition that we were just talking about fractured in exactly the way that I'm describing. And really what happened was, we think about Johnson's Great Society, and we think about Kennedy and some of these other candidates essentially siding with the civil rights movement. Where Democrats at that time made a choice, an active choice, to say, look, the civil rights movement is becoming one of the most important political sort of topics of the present period. We've got essentially, the Million Man March is happening. We've got these massive demands that are being put on the system. And at the same time, we also have individuals in our coalition, especially Southern whites, who oppose essentially the end of segregation, who oppose these new sort of Great Society policies, and they're all Democrats. And so, what do we do? And so, ultimately, they were forced with a choice. And so, for example, LBJ, who again, not the most progressive individual in the entire world in terms of his personal politics, ended up sort of realizing and coming around to the idea that implementing these reforms is essentially going to be the right thing to do from an electoral standpoint, as well as from in response to the civil rights movement. And so essentially many Southern whites who were Democrats at the time, which goes all the way back to the Civil War, essentially, right? The Lincoln Republicans were Republicans who supported Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and other, fundamental aspects of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Southern Democrats were those who opposed Lincoln's platform of ending slavery. And so this party, remember we talked about the idea that party identifications are extraordinarily stable and powerful, right? We had individuals who essentially that Democratic Party identification in the South meant something very different than it did in the North. And across time ended up continuing to have that D sort of label in the one-party systems of Southern states. And so at that moment, eventually, we had this de-alignment where many Southern Democrats started to break away from the Democratic Party and rethink their political loyalties. And so that, again, is an example of where this New Deal coalition was essentially too large and resulted in civil rights essentially being the issue that split apart that coalition and resulted in a massive realignment that changed the fates of the Republican and Democratic parties and their relative strongholds in different states and their level of support for different candidates forever. So today, again, parties are always trying to compete at the edge of their coalition, seeking to grab a few more voters that fit some characteristic who are going to find one policy to be more appealing or less appealing. And again, right, this is the strategy, the all of the wheeling and dealing of the candidates in thinking about crafting their messages and thinking about the debates, the kinds of things that they emphasize. This is really the guts of like political campaigning. It's really about trying to think about the edges of those two tents and how you might be able to just grab a few more voters on one side or a few more voters on the other side in a way that changes the electoral map. And so this is one of the explanations, going all the way back to the beginning of this video, this is one of the fundamental explanations as to why we see that party identification, though very stable at the individual level, still nevertheless shifts somewhat at the macro level in terms of the entire electorate. And that is partially because the campaigns of candidates are always competing for these marginal voters who are on the edges of these tents, who are not well served by the major party platforms. Essentially, parties are constantly trying to reinvent themselves to respond to new issues, to sort of grab those additional voters and start to tip the balance of the electorate in their favor. However, and the last thing I'll say about this is that, again, what we have today is candidate-centered parties that are designed almost as these, I like to call them jetpacks, where they're just available for whichever candidate is able to win a primary and signal their quality to strap on and sort of blast into orbit through fundraising and through volunteering and through phone banking and text banking and all the efforts of the party. But again, part of this candidate-centered party is actually at its core a weakness that is to say that they can't always control which parties get selected by the voters, and they can't always control what kinds of messages those candidates might talk about. And so that's ultimately where the political party system currently is grappling with the difficulty of having candidates that are essentially leading the party. So we think about the Donald Trump nomination in 2016. That was something that sort of mainstream Republicans, it came as a big surprise to them. There were many other more mainstream Republican candidates like Jeb Bush who were probably more preferred by the sort of core insider Republican elite. Nevertheless, Donald Trump comes in and sort of kicks down the door and says, hey, I have an appeal that Republican primary voters started to recognize, and lo and behold, right, sort of here we are. And so again, Parties are strong, parties are powerful, parties raise billions of dollars in election cycles to support candidates. That does not mean that they're machines. It doesn't mean that they control every aspect of this process, either from the nomination stage through to the actual influence on getting voters on their side. So again, I hope that this kind of very brief overview of some of our current thinking about political parties was interesting. Hopefully it gave you some food for thought. And I really look forward to talking more about this topic with you during our class discussion. Have a wonderful week, and I'll talk to you next time.